The river was black in the hour before dawn, and the only sound was the slap of bare feet on wet stones. Teenage boys in oversized helmets and worn uniforms stumbled down the bank of the Ebro, rifles held high to keep them dry. The air smelled of mud, sweat, and the sour reek of the rubber assault boats they were dragging behind them. Orders hissed along the line instead of being shouted. No smoking, no talking. Keep moving. The Republican High Command needed surprise more than anything else. On paper, this night crossing in July 1938 was the bold stroke that might turn the Spanish Civil War around. In reality, it rested on kids who had been farmhands and students a year earlier, now wading into a current they could barely see. Among them were volunteers of the international brigades, men from Britain, America, France, and other countries who had come to fight fascism on Spanish soil. They trained beside Spanish conscripts barely old enough to shave, sharing cigarettes and stories of home in trenches that never quite stayed dry. Now they passed whispered jokes back and forth, just to hold down the fear in their chests. At the water's edge, officers counted off squads and pushed them toward the boats. The Ebro ran wide here, its surface smooth and deceptive. The far bank was held by Franco's nationalist forces, dug in along ridges and farmhouses. For weeks, Republican scouts had watched enemy units rotate out, leaving gaps. If the crossing succeeded, the Republic might punch deep into Catalonia and prove it was still fighting for its life. The first boats shoved off, rubber skins creaking under the weight of men and gear. Oars dipped in and out, barely disturbing the water. For a few minutes there was only breathing and the muffled scrape of wood against rubber. The current grabbed each boat and pulled it downstream, but the men adjusted, aiming for dark shapes on the opposite shore where guides waited with lanterns hooded in cloth. Halfway across, the silence broke. Somewhere downriver, a flare burst into life, white and cruel, hanging over the water. Someone on the nationalist side had heard or seen something they shouldn't have. Shouts drifted over the surface, thin at first, then sharper. A machine gun opened up, tracers skipping across the water in bright, straight lines. Boats lurched as bullets punched through rubber and bodies. Men fell overboard, boots and packs dragging them down before they could scream. Others paddled harder, teeth clenched, while officers yelled for them to keep low. The flare burned out, plunging everything back into darkness, but the river was no longer quiet. It was filled with splashes, curses, and the hollow pop of return fire from the far bank. Enough boats made it. Wet and shaking, the first waves of Republicans scrambled up the opposite shore, dragging themselves through reeds and mud. Engineers laid planks and ropes for makeshift bridges, while sappers cut barbed wire under fire. By dawn, they had established a bridgehead several kilometers long, surprising local nationalist units and driving them back from village after village. For the first days, it looked like victory. Republican flags went up over hilltops that had been under enemy control for months. Columns pushed forward through olive groves and vineyards, capturing prisoners who looked as young and tired as they were. In the trenches, soldiers whispered that maybe, just maybe, they could still win. But the Republic was weaker than it looked. Years of war had drained its supplies and shattered its experienced officer corps. The nationalists, backed by German and Italian support, had more artillery, more aircraft, and a leadership willing to grind down its own troops to break the enemy. Within a week, Franco's forces regrouped. Heavy guns rolled into position on high ground overlooking the bridgeheads. German-made planes circled above, their pilots veterans of bombing runs over cities like Guernica. Where the river bent, nationalist artillery zeroed in on the fragile pontoon bridges and crossing points. Shells fell with a violence that stunned men who had grown used to small arms fire and occasional mortars. Trenches carved into dusty hillsides collapsed under direct hits. Olive trees vanished in bursts of dirt and splinters. The Ebro itself became a killing field, crowded with wrecked boats and sections of broken bridge. Teenage soldiers who had crossed full of nervous energy now clung to shallow scrapes in the earth, praying the next shell would land somewhere else. Medical posts behind the lines overflowed with shattered bodies. The heat of the Spanish summer turned everything sour, water ran short, wounded men lay under canvas while flies settled on their bandages. The fighting settled into a brutal pattern. Republican units launched attacks to capture ridges and farmhouses that dominated the valley. Nationalist forces counterattacked with tanks and waves of infantry, then hammered retaken ground with artillery and dive bombers. Each hill changed hands several times. For the international brigades, the Battle of the Ebro became a last stand. Their ranks were already thin, whittled down by years of fighting from Jarama to Brunette. Along the Ebro, they held trenches beside Spanish boys who had never been far from their villages before the war. As summer edged toward fall, Republican losses mounted. Replacements grew younger and less trained. When units pulled back for rest, they did so over ground littered with shell fragments and burned-out trucks. The smell of the river changed, too. Men noticed it when the wind shifted, a sickly mix of rotting vegetation and something else they didn't want to name. By September, Franco's generals knew they had worn down the enemy. They pushed fresh divisions forward, supported by concentrated air power. Republican defenses bent, then snapped. Machine gun teams found themselves surrounded, their fields of fire reduced to a few dozen yards. Radio messages grew desperate. Requests for ammunition went unanswered as supply lines failed under bombardment. Retreat became unavoidable. Commanders on the Republican side ordered units back across the Ebro, trying to turn a collapse into an organized withdrawal. It was too late for many. Crossing points that had been crowded with eager young men in July were now craters and twisted metal. Boats overloaded with wounded and exhausted soldiers set out under direct fire from batteries that had spent weeks perfecting their aim. Some made it. Others took hits midstream, spilling men into the current. A few tried to swim, weighed down by gear and shock. Comrades on the near bank watched helplessly as heads went under and did not surface again. The river absorbed their bodies and carried them toward the Mediterranean. When the last Republican units slipped back to their own side of the Ebro in November, the offensive was over. The bridgeheads that had seemed so promising in July were gone. The Republic had exhausted its reserves in a battle it could not afford to lose and had failed to change the larger balance of the war. Within months, Franco's armies would push into Catalonia and toward final victory. Families on both sides were left to count their dead. Many never learned exactly where their sons fell. For the parents of the teenagers who had waded into the Ebro that first night, there was often no grave to visit, only the knowledge that somewhere downstream the river had taken what the guns had left. The Battle of the Ebro stands as the longest and bloodiest engagement of the Spanish Civil War. For the young volunteers who crossed that river in 1938, the price of trying to change history was paid in full before they could grow old enough to see how the war ended. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.